The wind howled across the prairie like a living thing, sharp as glass and merciless in its bite. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains that blurred the line between land and sky, until the whole world seemed swallowed by white. Every step Eleanor took sank knee-deep, the hem of her once beautiful dress soaked and stiff with ice. Her breath came in ragged bursts, clouding in front of her face before being snatched away by the wind. She had been walking for hours, though time had lost meaning in the storm. The last thing she remembered clearly was the sound of wagon wheels disappearing into the distance and her husband's voice, cold and final, "You'll fend for yourself now." Then the crack of the whip and the wagon was gone, leaving her standing in the snow with nothing but a small carpet bag and a heart full of disbelief. Eleanor had thought marriage was her escape. Back east, her prospects had been fading. Her father's debts had ruined their reputation, and when Charles Pennington proposed, a man promising a new life on his ranch out west, she'd accepted, desperate for security. But the man who smiled at her during their vows had turned cold before they'd even reached the frontier. He drank, he gambled, and he blamed her for his misfortunes. When she discovered that he had sold the ranch before they arrived, it was already too late. Now she trudged through a wilderness she didn't know, abandoned like a broken promise. The storm bit through her thin coat, and her hands, red and raw, clutched the useless carpet bag against her chest. Inside it was little more than a Bible, a hairbrush, and a photograph, one that was already beginning to curl and warp from the damp. "God," she whispered, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Please, help me." The wind didn't answer. Somewhere far off she thought she saw a flicker of light, but it vanished before she could be sure. Her vision blurred. Her legs trembled. She fell once, twice, each time slower to rise. Snow crept into her boots and sleeves until she could no longer feel her fingers. She had read stories about people freezing to death, how they grew sleepy at the end, how the cold began to feel like warmth. She was beginning to understand that now. Her knees buckled and she sank into the snowbank. For a moment she thought of her mother's voice singing by the fire, the smell of bread baking, the soft creak of the old wooden floor beneath her feet. Home, something she hadn't had in a long time. She lay back and closed her eyes, her body trembling less now. The storm roared overhead, but its fury sounded distant, almost gentle. Somewhere in her fading thoughts she wondered if anyone would ever find her, or if she'd simply vanish beneath the snow, forgotten like so many lost souls in this harsh land. Then, faintly, she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. A low, steady thud like hooves on packed earth. She tried to lift her head, but her body refused to move. The sound grew nearer, clearer, a horse, maybe two. Through half-closed eyes she saw a shadow move between the flurries. A man dismounted, his coat whipping in the storm, his lantern casting a pale glow. He shouted something she couldn't hear, then knelt beside her. Warm hands lifted her from the snow, and she thought she heard his voice, low, rough, and urgent before everything went dark. For the first time since the storm began, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. When Eleanor opened her eyes again, she thought she must have died and gone to heaven. Except heaven, she imagined, would not smell so strongly of hay, wood smoke, and horses. Her vision wavered, and the world swam in golden and gray tones. She lay on a pile of thick quilts near a flickering fire, her body heavy and stiff, her throat raw with thirst. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The storm, the cold, the sound of hooves, it all came back in flashes. Panic surged through her chest. She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp as dizziness washed over her. "You'll tear your stitches if you move too quick." The voice came from the shadows. A man's voice, deep and even, roughened by years of hard work and cold air. Eleanor's heart leapt. She turned her head toward the sound and saw him step into the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a day's worth of snow still clinging to his coat. His dark hair was damp, his face weathered but not unkind. His hand, scarred and calloused, held a tin mug of steaming broth. "You're safe," he said simply, setting the cup on a small table beside her. "You're at my ranch about 5 miles out from town. I found you in my barn last night." Eleanor's lips parted, but no sound came out. Shame burned in her chest. Found in his barn, like some lost animal. She swallowed hard and managed a whisper. I didn't mean to trespass," the man shrugged, leaning back on his heels. "If you hadn't, you'd be dead. So I'd say you chose wisely." He offered her the cup. She hesitated, but the warmth rising from it was too much to resist. Her hands trembled as she lifted it to her lips. The first sip seared her throat but sent a comforting heat through her body. He watched her silently, then finally asked, "What were you doing out there in a storm like that?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cup. The truth sat bitter on her tongue. "My husband," she trailed off. "He left me." The man didn't flinch or press her for more. He only nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly. "I see." For a while there was only the crackle of the fire and the soft shifting of the horses in the nearby stall. The barn was sturdy and clean, its walls lined with tools and hay bales. Everything about it spoke of discipline and care. A man who worked hard and lived simply. After some time, he spoke again. "Name's Miles Granger." "Eleanor," she murmured, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Eleanor," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "You're welcome to rest here till the storm passes. Got a spare bed in the cabin. It's warmer than this barn." Her first instinct was to refuse. She was alone, vulnerable, and this man, though kind, was still a stranger. But her body betrayed her. She could hardly lift her head, let alone walk through the snow again. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly. Miles's gaze softened. "You won't be. I don't leave folks to freeze, not even strangers." He stood and reached for his coat. "Stay put. I'll bring your things inside and heat some more soup. You'll need it." When he stepped out into the snow again, Eleanor let her eyes close. The barn creaked softly around her, the fire's warmth slowly seeping into her bones. For the first time in days, her heart eased its frantic pounding. Outside, she could hear the wind still raging, but inside the barn it was quiet, peaceful even. She didn't know this man or why fate had led her to his door, but one thing was certain. He had saved her life. And though she didn't yet realize it, Miles Granger had just changed it forever. By the time the storm finally broke, the world outside was buried under a thick quilt of snow. The air hung still and white, but inside the cabin, the crackle of fire and the faint scent of pine made the small space feel like another world entirely. Miles had carried Eleanor there himself before dawn, wrapped in a wool blanket and half-conscious. Now she lay on a narrow bed near the fire, her pale face shadowed by exhaustion. He had sat by her side most of the night, changing damp cloths, feeding the fire, and making sure she still breathed. He wasn't a man used to company. His days were quiet, his world measured in chores and silence. Since his wife Clara had died 3 winters ago, the cabin had been nothing but a shelter, a place to sleep, not to live. But now, watching this fragile stranger fight for her life, something in him stirred that he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. When Eleanor stirred, he rose from his chair. She blinked groggily, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Where am I?" Her voice was soft but clearer than before. "In my cabin," Miles answered. "You were half dead when I found you. Spent the night trying to thaw you out." Her gaze darted around the room. The wooden table, the stone hearth, the old rocking chair beside the window. The cabin was simple but sturdy, everything in its place. It was the kind of home built by steady hands and a steady heart. "I owe you my life," she whispered. Miles shrugged, though his expression softened. "You don't owe me a thing. I couldn't just leave you out there." Eleanor tried to sit up but winced. "I don't mean to trouble you. Once I regain my strength, I'll be on my way." "Where to?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. The truth was she had nowhere to go. No family left, no friends in this strange town, and no money. Her husband had seen to that before he vanished. She lowered her gaze, unable to answer. Miles nodded slightly as if he'd expected as much. "Then you'll stay here for now, until you're well enough to stand." Eleanor looked at him, her blue eyes still clouded with distrust, but beneath it, there was gratitude too. "Why are you helping me?" He turned back to the fire, poking the embers with a piece of wood. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it. Guess I'm just returning the favor." The words hung between them, soft but heavy with meaning. As the day wore on, Miles went about his chores, chopping wood and tending the horses, but he returned every hour to check on her. He brought her food, a bowl of stew, bread baked earlier in the week, and though she ate little, the color slowly returned to her cheeks. Later, when the light began to fade, Eleanor watched him from the bed. His movements were steady and deliberate, a man used to solitude. Yet there was a quiet kindness in everything he did. How he set her cup within easy reach. How he stoked the fire before leaving the room. "Thank you," she said softly. He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. You rest now. Tomorrow'll be clearer. The storm's passed. After he left, Eleanor stared into the flames, the firelight flickering across her face. She still didn't know what awaited her beyond this cabin, what people would say, or if her husband would ever return. But for now, wrapped in warmth and silence, she let herself breathe. Outside, the snow began to glimmer under the faint morning sun. Inside, a broken man and a lost woman shared the same fragile peace, the beginning of something neither had planned for but both desperately needed. It wasn't love yet. Not even trust. But it was hope. And that was enough. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, one shaped by healing and hesitant beginnings. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in white. The air was sharp, the mornings bright with frost. But inside the cabin, warmth lingered from the fire, from the scent of coffee, and from something gentler, something unspoken between the two souls now sharing the same roof. Eleanor regained her strength slowly. At first, she could barely walk from the bed to the table. Miles said little, but his actions spoke enough. He made sure her water stayed warm, her meals simple but hearty, and when she insisted on helping, he only grunted. "You'll help when you can stand steady." By the third morning, she did. When she emerged from the cabin wrapped in a shawl, the light caught the red in her hair, and the breath of cold air stung her lungs in a way that reminded her she was still alive. Miles was in the yard, chopping wood, his axe rising and falling in smooth, rhythmic motions. He looked up when he heard her step onto the porch. "You shouldn't be out here yet," he said. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "And I can't just sit inside while you do everything. I need to earn my keep." Miles leaned on the axe handle, studying her. "Ain't much to earn. You're recovering, not working off a debt." "Still," she insisted, "please let me help." He hesitated, then nodded toward the barn. "The horses could use fresh hay. Think you can manage that?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "I'll try." Inside the barn, the scent of straw and leather filled her senses. She moved slowly, careful of her balance, and found herself strangely comforted by the routine. Each small task, the sweep of the broom, the sound of a horse's snort, the rustle of hay, pulled her farther from the memories of the man who had left her to die. When Miles came by later, he found her brushing one of the mares, humming softly to herself. The sight stopped him. It had been years since music had filled that barn. For a moment he simply stood there, a quiet warmth rising in his chest. "You're good with her," he said. Eleanor startled slightly, then smiled. She just needed a gentle hand. "We all do." He nodded, but the words stayed with him longer than he expected. That evening, they ate together by the fire for the first time. The conversation was light, mostly about the ranch, the weather, the endless list of chores. Yet beneath the surface there was a growing ease between them, a fragile trust built not by words but by kindness repeated over and over. After supper, Eleanor mended one of Miles's worn shirts. He pretended not to notice, though he kept glancing her way. When she handed it back, neatly stitched, he said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she replied. "You've done more for me than you'll ever know." He met her gaze for a moment, steady, unguarded, and something flickered there. Something neither of them were ready to name. Outside, the moon rose over the snow-covered hills, casting silver light through the window. The wind had gentled, the world at peace for the first time in weeks. Eleanor watched the fire burn low and thought of how close she had come to dying in that very storm. Yet now here she was, warm, alive, and beginning to feel something she hadn't dared to in a long time. Safe. And though neither spoke of it, both she and Miles knew. The arrangement had changed. What began as simple mercy was slowly becoming something deeper, something that could, if they allowed it, heal them both. By the time the snow began to melt and the first buds of spring appeared along the fence line, life on Miles Granger's ranch had settled into something that felt almost normal. Eleanor had regained her strength, her cheeks now flushed with color instead of frostbite. She rose with the dawn, helped with breakfast, tended to the animals, and even managed a small vegetable patch near the cabin. For the first time in months, she smiled easily. The loneliness that once pressed down on her chest had lifted, replaced by quiet gratitude for the man who had saved her, and by a growing warmth she didn't dare name. But peace, as she was learning, rarely lasts long on the frontier. It started with the whispers. Miles came back from town one evening with a grim expression, the brim of his hat pulled low. When Eleanor asked what was wrong, he hesitated before answering. "People are talking," he said finally. "About us." Her heart sank. "What are they saying?" "That you're living here alone with me. You know how folks are." Eleanor swallowed hard. She'd felt the stares the last time she'd gone to the general store. The way women whispered behind gloved hands. The way the men looked at her with too much interest or suspicion. She'd wanted to believe it was her imagination. Now she knew better. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Miles crossed the room and set a hand on the back of her chair. "You didn't. I don't care what they say. Let them talk." But Eleanor knew that in a small town, talk could ruin a woman faster than a gun ever could. The following week, she decided to go into town herself, determined to face the gossip head-on. She carried a list of supplies and held her head high, though her stomach churned with nerves. Inside the mercantile, the shopkeeper's wife greeted her with polite frost. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Just Eleanor," she replied evenly. The woman's eyebrows lifted. Living up at the Granger place, I hear, quite independent of you." Eleanor bit her tongue and forced a small smile. "Mr. Granger was kind enough to help me when no one else would. I'm simply repaying his generosity." But the words did little to soften the judgment in the woman's eyes. By the time Eleanor left the store, her hands were shaking. She had endured pity before, but this cruel curiosity cut deeper than she'd expected. Miles noticed her silence when she returned. He didn't press her for details. He didn't need to. The set of her jaw told him everything. That night he lit the lantern early and sat across from her at the table. "Maybe it's time we made things right in the eyes of the town," he said quietly. Eleanor looked up, startled. "You mean—" He held up a hand.
"Not like that."
"Not unless you want it. But folks round here don't understand kindness without a name to it. I could say you're my housekeeper or cousin, something respectable." She nodded slowly, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't quite admit. But before they could settle on a plan, fate intervened. 2 days later, a rider appeared on the horizon. Miles was in the field when he spotted the man, a lean figure on a dark horse riding with grim purpose. As the stranger drew closer, Eleanor froze in the doorway. The blood draining from her face, it was Charles Pennington, her husband, alive, smug and very much aware that she was too. He dismounted with a sneer. Well, you're a hard woman to kill, Ellie." Miles's eyes hardened. "You've got no business here." Charles laughed, cold and cruel.
"She's my wife, Granger."
"And I've come to take what's mine." The easy peace of winter shattered in an instant, and Eleanor knew that the life she'd begun to rebuild was about to be tested by the very man who had destroyed it. The air between the three of them was sharp as broken glass. Charles dismounted slowly, brushing dust from his coat as if he owned the place. His smug grin told Eleanor everything she needed to know. He'd come not out of remorse, but greed. He always had. Miles stepped forward, placing himself between Eleanor and the man she once called husband. "You best turn that horse around," he said evenly, though there was steel beneath the calm. "You're not welcome here," Charles chuckled. "You're a brave man, Granger. But that's my wife standing behind you. And everything she's been using here, your food, your roof, your time, belongs to me." Eleanor's stomach turned. "You left me to die," she said, her voice trembling. "You abandoned me in a storm with nothing." Charles's expression hardened. "You should have stayed where I told you. You'd have been fine if you hadn't wandered off like a fool." Miles took a step closer, his shadow falling across the other man. "Watch your mouth." Charles's hand twitched toward his coat. "Or what?" The moment froze. The barnyard was silent except for the restless shifting of horses. Eleanor's breath hitched. She saw Miles's hand hover near the gun at his hip, his stance easy but coiled. Charles laughed, but there was unease in the sound. "You think you can play hero? I've got law on my side. She's still my wife, whether she likes it or not." Eleanor's heart pounded. She could almost feel the old fear crawling back, the fear that had once kept her silent. "But not this time. Not here. She's not yours," Miles said quietly. Charles sneered. "That's not your decision to make." Eleanor stepped forward then, her voice rising, steady despite the tears stinging her eyes. It's mine, I decide. You left me for dead, Charles. You lost any right you had to call me wife the moment you rode away. Her words cut through the cold air like the crack of a whip. Charles blinked, stunned for a heartbeat, then his fury returned full force. He lunged toward her, but before he could take a step, Miles had drawn his gun. The barrel glinted in the afternoon light. Try that again, Miles said in a low growl, and you'll regret it. For a tense moment, the world held its breath. Then in the distance came another sound, the thud of hooves and the jingle of a bridle. Sheriff Dugan rode up, a heavy-set man with a weathered face and eyes that missed nothing. What's going on here? He barked. Charles straightened quickly, his tone shifting from threat to charm. Sheriff! Glad you're here. This man's harboring my wife. She's mine by law, and I've come to reclaim her. The sheriff's eyes flicked to Eleanor, then to Miles. That true? Eleanor took a step forward, her voice steady. It's true he was my husband, but he left me to die in the snow. I've got witnesses in town who saw me arrive alone, half frozen. He's no husband, he's a thief and a liar. The sheriff studied her face, then turned his gaze on Charles. That's so. Charles opened his mouth to argue, but the sheriff cut him off. I heard talk of a woman left out in the storm last winter. Folks said she was near dead. That's attempted murder where I come from. Miles lowered his gun, but his eyes stayed fixed on Charles. The sheriff stepped forward, pulling a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. You'll come with me, Pennington. We'll let the judge sort it out. Charles sputtered, his confidence finally cracking. You can't try me, the sheriff said, snapping the cuffs around his wrists. As the sheriff led him away, Eleanor stood still, her knees weak. It was over. The man who had haunted her life was finally gone. Miles turned to her, his voice gentle now. You all right? Eleanor let out a shaky breath and nodded, tears spilling freely at last. I think so. For the first time, I truly am. Miles gave a small nod, holstering his gun. Then it's done. But deep down, they both knew it wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something new, fragile, and real. The first day of freedom and perhaps the first day of love. Spring settled gently over the valley. The snow melted from the hillsides, revealing the tender green of new grass. Birds returned, their songs drifting through the open cabin window, soft and steady as a promise. Life was beginning again, and so was Eleanor. It had been 3 weeks since Charles's arrest. The sheriff had ridden out twice since then, gathering testimony and assuring Eleanor that her husband would stand trial for abandonment and attempted murder. The law would do what it must, but Eleanor had already decided. She would no longer live chained to that name. Each morning she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Miles chopping wood. The cabin had taken on a new rhythm, one that felt neither like rescue nor obligation but partnership. She helped where she could, tending the garden, patching fences, baking bread that filled the small home with warmth. It wasn't the life she'd once imagined for herself, but it was real. It was hers. Still, healing wasn't simple. There were nights when she woke sweating, her heart pounding with old fear. Sometimes she'd sit by the window watching the stars, reminding herself that the door was unlocked, that she was free to leave any time she wished. Miles never asked what haunted her. He didn't need to. He simply poured her a cup of tea and sat nearby, silent and steady as the mountains themselves. One evening, after a long day fixing the corral, Miles found her sitting on the porch steps. The sun had dipped low, painting the horizon in amber and rose. She looked peaceful, but her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. You thinking about leaving? He asked gently. She glanced up at him, surprised. Why would you think that? He shrugged, settling beside her. You've been quiet lately. Folks who've been through what you have, they get a look sometimes, like they're already halfway gone. Eleanor smiled faintly, though there was sadness in it. I suppose I've been waiting for the world to tell me where I belong. I spent so long trying to be someone's wife, someone's responsibility. Now I don't know what to be. Miles nodded, his eyes fixed on the fading light. You don't owe anyone an answer. Least of all me. You stay because you want to, not because you're beholden. She studied him for a long moment. And if I did want to stay? He met her gaze then, steady, cautious. Then you'd be welcome always. Silence fell between them, comfortable this time. The kind that didn't demand words. Over the next few days, something between them began to shift. So slowly, so naturally, neither could say when it started. Miles found himself smiling more often. Eleanor's laughter, rare but bright, began to fill the cabin again. She started leaving wildflowers on the table, and once he caught her humming as she kneaded dough, sunlight streaming across her face. He didn't say it aloud, but she was becoming the heart of the place. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the roof, Eleanor spoke again of her past, not in fear this time, but with calm. She told Miles about her parents, her life back east, and the mistakes she'd made believing love meant obedience. Miles listened, his rough hands folded quietly on the table. "Love ain't supposed to break you," he said after a while. "It's supposed to build you." Eleanor met his eyes, a slow, genuine smile curving her lips. "Then maybe I never knew what it really was. Not until now." He didn't answer, but the warmth in his gaze told her everything. That night, when she finally went to bed, the storm outside lulled her to sleep instead of frightening her. For the first time in years, her dreams were peaceful. The past was still there, scarred and cold, but it no longer defined her. Eleanor was learning to live again, and maybe, just maybe, to love. By the time summer reached the valley, the ranch was alive again. The fields shimmered with green, the creek ran clear, and the air smelled of earth and new beginnings. The harsh winter that had nearly taken Eleanor's life felt like a distant dream now, softened by sunlight and time. The cabin had changed too. There were curtains on the windows now, stitched by Eleanor's hands, and flowers blooming along the front porch. Miles had built a small pen near the barn where she tended a few chickens, her laughter drifting across the yard whenever one escaped her grasp. Life had a rhythm again, steady, simple, good. The trial in town had ended swiftly. Charles Pennington was found guilty of desertion and fraud, sentenced to years of hard labor in another territory. When the news reached them, Eleanor stood silently for a long while by the fence line, the breeze lifting her hair. Miles came up beside her, unsure if she would cry. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "It's over." And the relief in her voice said everything. From that day forward, she carried herself differently, shoulders straighter, steps surer. The fear that once shadowed her eyes was gone, replaced by quiet strength. And every time Miles looked at her, he saw not the broken woman he'd found in his barn that winter, but someone reborn. Still, something between them had shifted, ripened like fruit in the sun. They both felt it, though neither had dared speak it aloud. Not yet. One evening, when the sky blazed gold and the smell of rain hung in the air, Miles stood on the porch watching Eleanor gather laundry from the line. The breeze tugged at her skirt, the light haloing her hair. He felt a tug in his chest, deep and certain. He had spent years building walls around his heart after losing Clara, but Eleanor had slipped past them quietly, not through charm or beauty, but through grace. The way she faced her pain, the way she brought warmth back into his cold, silent world. When she came up the steps smiling at him, he finally found the courage to speak. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I've been thinking." She tilted her head. "That sounds dangerous," she teased, a faint smile curving her lips. He chuckled under his breath. "Maybe, but I figure I'd best say what's been sitting on my mind before I lose my nerve." Her laughter faded, replaced by stillness. "Go on." He took a breath, his hands rough and uncertain at his sides. "When I found you that night, I didn't expect you'd stay. Didn't think I'd want anyone to. But this place..." He glanced toward the barn, the fields, the cabin. "It's not just mine anymore. It's ours if you'll have it." For a heartbeat, she couldn't speak. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his. "Are you asking me what I think you're asking?" Miles's voice dropped low. "I'm asking if you'd stay as my wife, as my heart." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of peace. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. 1,000 times yes." He smiled then, small and genuine, before drawing her close. The kiss they shared was not born of passion alone, but of gratitude. 2 lives rebuilt from ruin, 2 hearts stitched together by kindness. The next morning, the town woke to the news quietly. Miles Granger had taken a wife. Some whispered, others smiled, but neither of them cared. They had already faced worse storms than gossip. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Eleanor stood on the porch wearing a simple ring of gold. The wind danced through the wheat, carrying the scent of lilacs and promise. Once she had been left to die in the cold. Now she stood alive and loved, wrapped not in frost but in warmth. The warmth of a man's kindness that had become her home. And in that golden light of spring, Eleanor knew her story had come full circle. Not an ending, but a beginning.